to the first session. In the first session, we have two papers being presented. The first one is by Valeria Jiménez. As I've already introduced her, just to repeat, she is a junior researcher at the IPE and a PhD student. And she will present on wage shares and demand regimes in Central America, an empirical analysis for Costa Rica, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Panama, 1917 till 2016. Valeria, the floor is yours. You have your 25 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. Let me just share my screen. Okay. So can you see it fine? No? Yes, great.
I think it's all fine, but you should choose the presentation mode. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, okay, yes. Yeah, so as Eker just mentioned, I estimated the demand regimes for 5 Central American countries, so specifically El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. Unfortunately, I could not include Guatemala and Belize because of lack in data. My motivation to do this study is based on the fact that Central American countries are among the most unequal countries in Latin America, which is already the most unequal region in the world. So you can see in figure 1, just to get an idea, that these countries all have very high levels of inequality. At the same time, we can see on figure 2 that average growth rates in the last decade were lower in most countries than what they were during the 70s. And this is interesting because there was a major shift from this state-led development, so what is commonly known as the import substitution industrialization model, to an export-oriented neoliberalism, right? And this included the implementation of policies such as liberalization of capital accounts and flexibilization of labor markets. And yeah, we know the story. And all of this was supposed to enhance economic growth, but as we can see, this has not really been the case. So that's why I decided that I wanted to do this study and to see what would happen if we have a redistribution of income, what would happen to GDP. So to do this, I am based on the post-Kaleckian distribution and growth model, so the Baduri-Maclean model, which I will present briefly for those of you who are not familiarized with this model. And the demand regimes have been estimated for other Latin American countries as well. So then I will show the empirical findings from previous studies. I will then refer to data that I used and show some stylized facts. I will talk about the methodology, show the empirical results, and then close with some policy implications. Okay, so the post-Kaleckian distribution growth model is a model with markup pricing. So domestic prices are set by firms who add a markup M to the average variable cost. So we have the wage cost and the material cost. Let me just select the pointer here. Yes, and then we have the profit share H, which is determined by the markup and the relationship between unit material cost and unit labor cost. And finally, in this model, the real exchange rate is taken as an indicator for international competitiveness. And this indicator will be affected by changes in the distribution as well. So how so is summarized in this table, which shows that it depends on where the cost of the distributional change is coming from. So if we have a change in the markup, there is an inverse relationship between the profit share and international competitiveness. And on the other hand, if the change is coming from nominal wage or the exchange rate, then we have a direct relationship between the profit share and international competitiveness. So these are the foundations of the model. And in order to analyze what happens to capacity utilization if there's a change in distribution, the starting point is the goods market equilibrium. So we have that saving has to be equal to investment plus net export. And if we normalize this by the capital stock, we get that the saving rate has to be equal to the capital accumulation rate plus the net export rate. So we can substitute those equations, which are here. So we have the saving rate is a function of the propensities to save. So we have the propensity to save out of profits and the propensity to save out of wages. And it is assumed that the propensity to save out of profits is higher than the propensity to save out of wages. Then for capital accumulation, we have that it's a function of capacity utilization and the profit share. And finally, the net export rate, which is a function of the real exchange rate, as well as domestic and foreign capacity utilization. So when we substitute that in the previous equation, we get the equilibrium values for utilization and capital accumulation. And then we can estimate what the effect is of a change in the profit share. But what we get is an indeterminate effect in the numerator. So we don't know the sign of this derivative. And that's why it is an empirical question. And of course, this has been addressed for many countries, especially developed countries. But recently, there have also been efforts to do this study for developing countries as well. And in general, there have been two main approaches which have been followed. So the structural approach and the aggregative approach. The aggregative approach relies on the estimation of the reduced form solution for output. So output is reduced on lags of the dependent variable itself, on the profit share, and some control variables for each component of aggregate demand. And the structural approach is different because the effects of changes in distribution are estimated on each aggregate demand component separately. So on consumption, on investment, and net exports. And then we can add them up to have the total effect. Of course, both approaches have some downsides. So specifically, the structural approach has been criticized because it does not consider the interaction between the components of GDP. So the interactions between consumption, investment, and net exports are left out. And also, distribution is assumed to be exogenous. So this means that this could lead to a simultaneously biased problem. The aggregative approach has the disadvantage, on the other hand, that it does not allow for the detection of the specific economic relationships that are leading to a change in demand. And since I was especially interested in knowing the difference between the domestic and the total demand, I decided to go for the structural approach. It has also been the most common one applied until now for Latin American countries. This table here shows the results for Latin American countries, for some of them. So the most studied ones until now had been Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico. And we can see in general that there is consensus that domestic demand is wage-led for these 4 countries in this table. There are some discrepancies for total demand. So we have some studies finding wage-led total demand and others profit-led demand. And I tried to find some explanations of these discrepancies. And what I found is that usually it's because of technicalities in the specification. So here we can directly see that all of these studies consider different periods of time, which could be the most obvious explanation. There can also be other explanations like which controls were included in the regressions or other differences in the methodology followed. Then in this other table, these are countries which have only been studied once or for which there are no contradictory results. So for example, for Colombia and Peru, we have 2 studies and both of them found that domestic and total demand is wage-led. And here we have an interesting finding by Alarco for Bolivia. He finds that domestic demand is profit-led as well as total demand. And he finds the same for 3 Central American countries, namely Honduras, Nicaragua, and Panama. But this is a rather unconventional findings because usually when we have profit-led total demand, it is because of through the net export channel. So usually domestic demand is wage-led, and when we include the effect on net exports, it can be the case that total demand is profit-led. So it is interesting because whenever he found profit-led results, it was always in the domestic demand. And this is in contradiction to my findings, because I do find wage-led domestic demands for all the Central American countries that I considered. So specifically, when it comes to my study, I don't know why here. Yeah, I considered the longest period for which data was available. So I considered the period 1970 to 2016. Most data I got from the World Development Indicator database, also from the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and some variables I had to go to the respective central banks to get the data. Okay. So here is the behavior of the wage shares in Central America. So for example, in Costa Rica, we can see a clear increase in the wage share throughout the whole period, especially since the 80s. In El Salvador, we see important increases during the 70s in the wage share that basically got lost in the last decade. So we're back to levels similar to 1970. Honduras has been basically oscillating through time, and Nicaragua, which had a stable period in the 70s, went through a very volatile period and now finally stabilized and shows a slightly increasing trend, and seems to have stabilized at a lower level than in the 70s. Okay, finally, we have Panama, which is like the most extreme case where we can see that the wage share has been decreasing basically throughout the whole period. But it's important to mention here that Panama has a particularity, which is that Panama is a tax haven. And it has been shown that it is usual for tax haven to show extraordinarily high profit shares, and in general to have overestimated macroeconomic statistics. So this is something that we have to keep in mind when talking about the case of Panama. Okay, so here are the average growth rates of GDP. As you can see, in Costa Rica, El Salvador, and Honduras, we never went back to the growth rates of the 70s and have been growing at lower rates since then. Nicaragua is a special case because of internal political problems, which intensified in 1978 until 1990. So that's why we also see here very low rates. We finally see some picking up in the last few years. And finally, Panama is the country which has grown the most ever since the 90s. So already by seeing the behavior of the wage share and the average growth rates of Panama, we can already suspect that this will turn out to be a profit-led country. But of course, we need to do the empirical analysis to know for sure. Okay, so these are the regressions that I estimated. For consumption, I included profits and wages as explanatory variables. For investment, GDP and the profit share. And for net exports, although I tried different specifications, this was the only one which gave satisfactory results. So I included own GDP, GDP of the rest of the world, and the profit share as explanatory variables. And this was the general procedure that I followed. So I started by doing a unit root test, specifically the augmented decay test, to see if the series were stationary or not. Most of them were non-stationary. So I then did a co-integration test. And whenever there was evidence of co-integration, I estimated an error correction model. And if there was no evidence of co-integration, then I estimated inverse differences. Whenever the series were stationary, which only happened for the net export estimation, I also included a lag as a regressor in order to avoid autocorrelation problems. So these are the results for consumption. So for El Salvador, I estimated an error correction model, and for the rest of the countries, the estimation is inverse difference. In general, we can see that significance levels are high, which is shown with the stars. Standard deviation is in the parentheses. And also, I did some tests on the results, specifically the Roche-Godfrey test for autocorrelation and the White test for heteroscedasticity. And yeah, we can see that none of these results have either of these problems. Also, I included some dummy variables whenever there was a particular event, or if there was a structural break. So in the case of El Salvador, there was a structural break in 1989. You can see it directly in the graph, but I used the Gregory-Hansen test to identify the year of the structural break. Okay, but what we're mostly interested in are in the marginal effects, right? So this table shows what is the effect of a 1 percentage point increase on consumption. And as we can see, the effect is negative in all countries, which is as expected, because I mentioned that it's expected that the propensity to save out of wages is higher than the propensity to consume out of profits. Yeah. Okay, so this was as expected. These are the empirical results for investment. And here I did not find any statistical significance from the profit share on investment for any of the countries. And of course, I tried to find some explanations of why this was the case. And in particular, okay, I found two possible explanations. The first one is that I could not include the interest rate, which prevented from a more robust estimation because of lacking data. And another explanation could be that for export-oriented emerging markets like these countries, investment depends on international competitiveness as these countries seek foreign capital inflows. So in that sense, domestic profit margins in comparison to a rival country is probably something that matters most for long-term investment. This was, of course, out of the scope of my work, but it's a possible explanation of why we don't have a significant effect of the profit share. So basically, the marginal effect then would be 0 when it comes to investment. And finally, we have the empirical results for net exports, where we have also the expected results. So we have a positive effect from GDP of the rest of the world and a negative one from domestic GDP. We also found some significance of the profit share, and based on this, then I estimated the marginal effects. And we can see that for some countries, the effect is positive, and for others, negative. So once with the 3 marginal effects, we can add them up to see what the global effect is and classify the demand regimes. So this table here shows that. So basically, since there is no statistical significant effect on investment, we have that domestic demand is wage-led in all the countries. And then when it comes to total demand, we have also wage-led total demand in Costa Rica, El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua. And Panama is resulted profit-led. So it was the only country which resulted profit-led from this 5. And also I tried to think, okay, what could be a possible explanation for this? And a possible one is that Panama is a more open economy. So measured through export GDP ratio is a more open economy than the rest in the whole period. The gap has been closing, but still throughout the whole period it has been the most open economy. So it could be one explanation of why Panama resulted profit-led while the others wage-led. And then, okay, what does these findings mean in terms of policy? So as I mentioned at the beginning, within the neoliberal macroeconomic paradigm that has dominated in the region as much as in the world since the 1980s, implied that an implementation of a set of pro-capital policies in most of these countries. So we're talking about labor market flexibility, lower minimum wages, the weakening of collective bargaining institutions, the exemption of capital gains from income taxation, and so on. But what we see is that in all of these countries, it has given rise to a process of increased inequality and the impoverishment of the working class. We also see weak demand and weak economic growth. So basically, these measures did not promote the sustainable growth process that they were supposed to promote. And at the same time, we know that these policies have contradicted the wage-led nature of domestic demand in all 5 countries and of total demand in all countries but Panama. So in that sense, I think it must be in income distribution and aggregate demand must be reconsidered. Another important point is that we passed from a region that tried to integrate during the import substitution industrialization model or period to a region which is now basically competing to attract foreign direct investment. And they do so by following the same competitive strategy of offering lower wages and tax incentives. And we can see that this is not a sustainable strategy for this region. As an alternative, I think it would be appropriate to follow a strategy based on pro-labor distributional policies, which would make a wage-led growth process more likely. Even more so if we talk about coordinated policies. So in that sense, I think there's a lot of room to consider coordinated policies, not only in Central America, but in general in Latin America. And finally, I think that even in a profit-led country such as Panama, there is room to reduce inequalities without affecting aggregate demand. And specifically, this can be done by decreasing wage or labor income inequality. And I found some data that shows the distribution of labor income by decile. And we can see that although there have been some improvements to the benefit of the middle of the distribution, there's still a lot of space to reduce labor income inequalities. And the same applies to Costa Rica, because although this country does show an increase in the wage share in the period, we also see that it has been associated with an increase in inequality of labor income towards the highest or the richest deciles in the distribution. So I think that's the message in general. There is space in the region to reduce inequalities without affecting economic growth. And in fact, it could even be beneficial for economic growth in years to come. And I think now with the COVID pandemic, it has become clear that it is unsustainable to keep these high levels of inequality. And in fact, last week, during a forum on sustainable development for Latin America, it was a huge, a central topic in the discussion. And basically the final remark was that it was time to end this culture of privilege in Latin America and to prioritize decent work and social protection. So I think in that sense, this study becomes relevant as it shows that there is space to do so. Yeah, thank you.